We've all lost inspiration, motivation, or focus in planning our next D&D game. Creative blocks can feel especially bad when you have less than a week before you need to run your next session, or you have to cancel some social plans with your friends. So here's my method for getting some quick and easy inspiration for your game. Unfortunately, it starts by getting up and going outside. So, there are three categories of inspiration I want to talk about today. They are the natural, the historical, and the local. Let's start with nature. First off, going on any sort of a trip with an experienced outdoorsman will absolutely teach you something, at very least. From the fact that nettles can be brewed into a drinkable, nutritious tea, to learning which berries are safe, to learning various knots, practical experience in the outdoors should not be underestimated as a tool in your DM arsenal. If you happen to camp in a cool spot, or see a beautiful vista while you're spending time outdoors, congratulations, you've just found the site of your next encounter. Or you've found a beautiful place for you to bring your creative muscles into describing to make your world feel so much more real to your players. But this doesn't have to end with a single encounter or vista. A long trek on your part can provide days of interesting descriptive content. You can stretch it out and go only to the interesting bits. And you can actually make that trek far more interesting by imagining what sort of monsters may lurk around every corner, barrow, hill, or dale. Maybe you see a small, scummy pond. Perhaps a sea hag has made her home there, turning the water brackish and salty like the sea. Perhaps she sits there because she's stranded from the nearby sea. And she's waiting for some hapless, clueless victim to fall into her clutches, to carry her back. Especially if you're walking with a partner or friend who is interested in this sort of exercise, the time is going to fly by as you bounce ideas off each other, naming places and creatures that could be lurking in the lands around you. Heck, if you're feeling very adventurous, I'd recommend getting out and doing an activity in nature. Rafting, bouldering, or just heading out on a tour of a local cave. Not only does this give you brilliant descriptive information which you can hammer straight into your next session, it also gives you potential inspiration for bigger adventures. There is a town in my world now that transports lumber across a series of rapids using shallow-bottomed boats. And I've run an entire mini-campaign based on a complex of caves, and the idea of caving being so claustrophobic, windy, and much less simple than you might expect from the classic video game style cave. The best thing about cribbing from nature is that it's very easy to introduce natural elements to your players, seeing as a lot of the time adventuring is found out of the walls of a city. And even when adventure takes place in urban environments, what fantasy city is complete without a cave system underneath it? Or some cliffs somewhere to make it all a little more interesting. A final tip is that even if the nature in your local area doesn't look at all like the fantasy area where your players are currently adventuring, don't let that put you off. A desert may well have no running water in it, which means your whitewater rafting trip may feel wasted until you think, well, perhaps the locals like to ride sand dunes down in flat-bottomed boats, treating them almost like rapids, as the moving sand moves everything along with them. Maybe your experience bouldering across a cliff face is also useful in describing your players moving along a giant stone city wall. Or perhaps in your setting, this cave that your players are in wasn't made by water, as all of our caves are, but rather by some horrid, grand, burrowing creature. Unless you live in the depths of modern suburbia, in a town younger than your own grandfather, history surrounds you. Heck, even in that case, history is still a great source of inspiration. It just might require a bit of reading and research instead of what I'm about to propose. Oftentimes, some of the smallest and strangest places you may ever visit will have a local history museum, which is the perfect place to get all sorts of inspiration around side quests, folklore, and places of interest to a local community. In other words, the perfect place from which to build an imaginary town. Did a great fire break out in this place 100 years ago? Well, that would make for an interesting set piece if your players were there. Is there a history of shipwrecks and life rafts in this place? Why not have your players arrive somewhere very similar in the midst of a storm? Either on the boat that is about to be shipwrecked themselves, or standing on the cliffs, watching a boat being tossed by the waves, debating whether to help, or how to help. If there's a history of moonshining, or some specific local industry like bell making, boat making, prospecting, or heck, even smuggling, that can serve as the basis for an entire town and a whole settlement in your fantasy world. I went to a local history museum this weekend and came away, actually, with this. A census from 1901 containing names, professions, and families, all from a specific period of time in a specific interesting place. This sort of thing is a godsend for anyone seeking to evoke any sort of historical period in their games. And it serves almost as a curated random name generator, without the possibility of names that don't fit in this particular setting. I may be biased, being a local tour guide myself, but taking a tour of any historically significant place can be an absolute godsend for anyone who's feeling a bit stuck. You'll get so much information, from historical tidbits, like learning that most medieval cities in Britain had one single small street on which every operating butcher would have to be, to facts that really make you think about your own world building in a new light. For instance, that almost every European Christian church was built from the East End first, so that the altar and worship could begin as quickly as possible. A single story or fact may inspire you. A single battle may inspire a whole war or campaign in your mind, or a local legend may find itself taking root in your psyche. All of these things are perfect to inspire you in your next session, and perhaps your next few. Where I run tours, there is an absolute goldmine of legends and NPCs to pick from. There is a local legendary dragon slayer, a serial army deserter turned geriatric horse thief, and even a ton of fascinating, specific local ghost stories. Tales and adventure hooks for many of the tiers of play, maybe not 4th tier, can be found in your local area, in local heritage and history. I guarantee you, just ask the right people and steal from that shared storytelling knowledge of us as humans in folklore and history. As a last resort, you can even read a book, although I will say that is probably the slowest way to find that crystallised little nugget of information that is going to branch out, blossom into your next session. Look around, ask around, and seek out those strange stories. Because, remember, almost every creature in D&D is in some way inspired by folklore, heritage, myth, or legend. The final step to getting over your creative block as a game master is actually the easiest. It doesn't require you to explore the wilderness, to go to a museum, or, God forbid, talk to people. Simply go outside and look around your local area. I swear to you, even if you think there is nothing at all of interest in your local area, you'll find something if you're looking. After all TTRPGs start with that very foundational children's game of make-believe. As kids, we found interesting things in our local area, at least interesting to us, and when we couldn't find any, we made stuff up. A troll living under a local bridge. Ooh, that playground is haunted. That old dilapidated hut on the edge of the lake. All of these are breeding grounds for interesting stories. To prove this, I've taken a walk around my local area, which is a tiny little nubbin of growth on the end of a larger settlement. The local pub has been bought by a new owner, who's decided wisely to keep one of the only interesting features about the bar, which is that the bar itself is rescued wood from an old ship, despite us being miles and miles inland. Perhaps in your game this old owner was some merchant or sailor who ran into bad luck on the waves and worse luck in business, having to sell up his only remnants of his old ship. Perhaps the wood of the ship itself is cursed. Two car dealerships sit next to each other, right next to each other, in direct competition. One has the better dressed salesman, the other plays loud music. Perhaps in your world these are two competing stables, with two bitter rivals as owners, locked in such a fierce feud that one of them has decided to hire a local bard to sing insulting songs about the other stable. And in my town there's one small, unassuming suburban street, which nonetheless every night just before dusk plays host to hundreds of ravens and crows that nest up on top of the eaves of the houses. It's a bizarre sight. One house in particular always has more black birds than any other. Perhaps that's the sign that there's a local witch in my town. None of this stuff is particularly dramatic or interesting on its own, but by applying some childlike imaginative wonder, we can shape and mould these innocuous, unassuming facts of life into stories. Something that can inspire a session, a side quest, an NPC, or even a whole campaign. Imagine, if you will, that the strange rural landlocked tavern in which your characters meet for the first time actually ends up containing the remnants of the ghost ship which haunts the local coast, searching for the wood to put itself back together, which has been stolen and cursed. That, to me, sounds like a damn fun adventure. And one last note. It's important to remember that as creatives, we will never be able to simulate the complex, convoluted, strange and confusing idiosyncrasies that exist in our real world. That may seem irritating, but it's not. This just means that we can take inspiration from the folklore and the stories that have been told before us, reducing the creative workload on our end. As humans, we've always told stories. All we need to do is listen and watch the world around us. And we will never be bored. And we will never run out of ideas. That, in my mind, is humanity's defining characteristic. There are always new stories to tell. And there are always old stories to rework. Touch grass, ladies and gentlemen. It'll help you think. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this style of video, let me know in the comments and please subscribe to the channel. I want to build a community of people who are as fascinated with how to tell stories in interesting worlds as I am. And please, do check out some of the other videos on the channel. I think they're pretty good. But all that remains for me to say is that I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.